How does a country overthrow a decades-old monarchy without a single popular uprising? And even more surprisingly, how does the general who loved the emperor most become the reluctant architect of the coup? This is not a story of ideology, but rather of confusion, rumors, and personal disagreements that became the fuse for a revolution. The proclamation of the Republic of Brazil marked the day that changed everything. And on the cold morning of that day, history was not made in the streets, but in the barracks. Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca, a convinced monarchist and personal friend of Emperor Dom Pedro II, was not there for Republican ideals. He was there out of sheer fury, driven by disagreements with the imperial cabinet and pressure from a small but highly influential group of officers. In Campo de Santana, the cavalry gathered. What appeared to be merely a military revolt over issues of pay and prestige quickly escalated into the overthrow of an empire that had lasted 67 years. The tension was palpable. The coup, essentially, was military theater. Of the approximately 14 million people living in Brazil in 1889, almost none participated or even immediately knew what was occurring. There was no French Revolution. There was a cabinet maneuver, a historical misconception. The Brazilian Republic was born fragile, devoid of popular support, led by a sick man who, ironically, preferred the monarchy. This is the seed of institutional fragility we carry to this day. But if Deodoro loved the emperor, what ultimately compelled him to betray his friend and master? We must go back a few years to understand the intricate web of personal and political intrigues that led a loyal monarchist to create our republic. To understand the role of a monarchist in the collapse of the monarchy, we must advance to the tense days of 1889, when Brazil, though vast and seemingly stable after 67 years of imperial rule, was on the brink of a collapse few outside the barracks and political clubs anticipated. The central figure was Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca, an imposing military hero, but one suffering physically and emotionally exhausted by the political maneuvering of Rio de Janeiro. Deodoro was, fundamentally, a monarchist. He held deep personal loyalty to Emperor Dom Pedro II. His conflict was not with the crown, but with the conservative cabinet led by the Viscount of Ouro Preto, who was systematically alienating the army. The fuse was lit by widespread rumors, whether true or strategically manufactured, that the cabinet was planning to arrest key military leaders, including Deodoro and the intellectual positivist Benjamin Constant. For Deodoro, this wasn't about politics, it was about military honor. The generals convinced him that the only way to save the army from imminent humiliation was to depose the current government. By the early hours of November 15, 1889, the stage was set for an event that would reshape the nation. Despite severe shortness of breath and fever, Deodoro, supported by his troops, rode through the streets of Campo de Santana toward the Ministry of War. It was less a revolution and more a highly choreographed military parade. There was no bloodshed. The crowds were small, mostly curious bystanders, perhaps less than 1,000 people, unsure whether they were witnessing a military drill or a political protest. This was the first great irony. The Republic, born in silence, was already demonstrating its distance from the people it claimed to represent. Deodoro confronted the Prime Minister, Ouro Preto, demanding the immediate dissolution of the cabinet. His initial objective, stated clearly to witnesses, was achieved. The ministry fell. The Marechal returned home, genuinely believing he had fulfilled his duty. He had protected the army's dignity while preserving the empire. For a brief, ambiguous moment, the monarchy had survived. But the political vacuum was instantly seized by the radical Republicans, led by Benjamin Constant and Rui Barbosa. They recognized the unique opportunity provided by Deodoro's illness and his successful but limited action. They applied intense pressure. By late afternoon, the original objective had been violently overwritten. The Marechal, exhausted, sick, and perhaps confused by the sudden shift in stakes, was convinced to sign the proclamation, declaring the establishment of a provisional Republican government. The monarchy was over, not by popular uprising, nor by the conviction of its reluctant leader, but by procedural missteps and personal feuds amplified by opportunists. Dom Pedro II, receiving the news calmly at his palace, noted the profound lack of public outrage. A vast empire which had spanned generations, vanished overnight without a single shot fired in its defense. This quiet, almost accidental revolution raises the haunting question. If the people didn't demand the republic, who truly benefited from its swift and silent arrival? And what does this tell us about the foundations upon which modern Brazil was built? The rapid and quiet end of the monarchy was not a sudden catastrophe, but the culmination of cracks that had been spreading across the foundations of the Second Empire for decades. To understand why a loyal monarchist like Deodoro da Fonseca raised a sword against the crown, we must look at the trio of forces that undermined Dom Pedro II, the disgruntled military, the betrayed planter elite, and the siren call of new ideologies. Following the devastating Paraguayan War, 1864-1870, the Brazilian military returned home victorious but profoundly dissatisfied. They had borne the heaviest burden, yet found themselves politically marginalized and undervalued by the centralized imperial structure. Historically, the military was barred from active political life, a rule that increasingly chafed against their new sense of national importance. This was a powder keg waiting for a match. Simultaneously, within the army's intellectual circles, a powerful new philosophy was taking root: positivism. Figures like Benjamin Constant, a brilliant military professor, championed a belief in scientific progress, order, and republicanism as the path to modernization, directly challenging the perceived stagnation of the monarchy. Positivism offered the army not just political relevance, but a messianic mission. But the fatal blow came not from ideological warfare, but from economic betrayal. On May 13, 1888, Princess Isabel signed the Lei Aurea, abolishing slavery instantly. While this was a monumental moral achievement, politically, it was catastrophic for the crown. It alienated the most powerful economic and political sector, the great coffee planters, the very pillars of the Conservative Party. These landowners, who controlled the vast majority of Brazil's wealth and political machinery, had invested astronomical sums in enslaved labor. When abolition occurred without the compensation they vehemently demanded, they declared war on the regime. Historian estimates suggest that the empire, in one stroke, eliminated approximately 50% of the agrarian elite's capital without repayment, replacing monarchical loyalty with revolutionary fury. They shifted from being staunch royalists to bitter republicans overnight, interested less in ideology and more in revenge and self-preservation. Dom Pedro II, the scholarly and beloved emperor, paradoxically hastened his own demise by clinging too tightly to a system that had ceased to function. The political structure was essentially a closed loop. During his reign, participation was limited to a tiny fraction. Estimates placed the eligible electorate at less than 1.5% of the population. Reform was necessary, but the emperor, weary and perhaps too stoic, allowed the political environment to calcify. He had no immediate male heir, and the succession of his daughter, Princess Isabel, was viewed with skepticism by both the military, who disliked her piety, and the conservative elite, who feared she was too liberal given her role in abolition. It was into this volatile mix, a disgruntled military, a vengeful aristocracy, and an exhausted emperor, that the Republican conspirators, led by Constant, struck. They played a dangerous game of misinformation, exploiting the personal pride of Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca. Deodoro was no ideologue. He was a traditionalist, a friend of the emperor, and a lifelong monarchist. He repeatedly stated, "I have always respected the emperor and I will die defending him." His motivation for leading the troops was not to overthrow the crown, but to stage a disciplinary demonstration against the current cabinet, particularly the Viscount of Ouro Preto, whom he believed was plotting to humiliate the army and arrest Republican leaders, including himself. On the eve of November 15th, the Marshal was sick, confined to his home, and deeply conflicted. He was coaxed, manipulated, and falsely informed that the government had already issued warrants for his arrest. It wasn't a philosophical awakening that drove him to the barracks. It was wounded honor and military solidarity. This was the ultimate irony of the Republic's birth. It was executed by a loyalist acting on personal grievance, not democratic fervor, against an emperor who, despite his failings, was widely respected by the population. The people, largely illiterate and disconnected from the political maneuverings of Rio de Janeiro, simply watched, silent observers to a changing of the guards, a mere exchange of flags. But if the foundations of the Republic were laid not by popular will, but by elite maneuvering and personal pique, what does that tell us about the long shadow of this historical accident? And how quickly would this Republic of the Generals forget the ideals its positivist architects had championed? Dom Pedro II's departure was silent and dignified, an imperial family sailing into exile almost without protest. The Republic, born of a swift decree rather than popular outcry, was fully consolidated in a matter of hours. Compared to the French or American revolutions, where the fight for liberty often involved mass bloodshed, the Brazilian regime change was merely a whisper. Brazil simply exchanged an emperor for a marshal, without the vast majority of its 14 million inhabitants even knowing what had transpired in the capital until days later. Here resides the profound lesson and the tragic plot twist of November 15, 1889. Brazil did not conquer its republic. It was delivered by a reluctant monarchist general. Deodoro da Fonseca, driven more by personal offenses and the strategic maneuverings of Benjamin Constant than by fervent republican convictions. This origin story, marked fundamentally by the absence of the people and the decision-making of military elites, planted a deep seed of institutional fragility that would endure across decades of Brazilian political life. The day that changed everything in Brazil was ultimately not about ideological purity, but about the immediate seizure of power. And this peculiar genesis forces us to confront a lasting question. When a nation builds its core institutional foundation in the complete absence of its own people, what is the true enduring price of freedom? This was just one of the days that shaped our world. Tomorrow we will publish another landmark historical event. To make sure you don't miss it, subscribe now to The Day That Changed Everything and turn on notifications. What other day would you like to see featured here? Comment below.